Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Lisa Matthews, Vice President of the club and Associated Press U.S. Video Assignment Manager. The killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis on May 25th convulsed the nation in Black Lives Matter protests and renewed an urgent outcry for police reform. At the same time, our nation has struggled to contain the coronavirus, which has struck communities of color disproportionately. Today, we welcome Congressional Black Caucus Chair Representative Karen Bass, a Democrat from California, who has devoted her decade in Congress to issues of criminal justice and disparities in health care. Representative Bass chairs the Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Crime and was tasked by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler with shepherding the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act through the legislative process. The act, which passed the House in late June, bans chokeholds and no-knock warrants, as well as lowering the legal barriers for bringing civil and criminal charges against police for misconduct. A police reform bill authored by Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina has stalled in the Senate after Democrats complained it did not do enough to curb police abuses and lacked key components, including an end to qualified immunity for police. Senator Scott and Representative Bass have tried to negotiate a compromise. It's something Representative Bass can claim as a bit of a specialty. Prior to her election to Congress in 2010, Representative Bass served in the California State Assembly, where in 2008 she became the first ever Black woman in U.S. history to serve as Speaker of any state legislature. Under her leadership, Republicans and Democrats in the Assembly came together to address California's financial crisis. Bass and three of her colleagues, another Democrat and two Republicans, were awarded a John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award in 2010. The judges recognized the political courage each demonstrated in standing up to the extraordinary constituent and party pressure they faced. Now, political pundits are buzzing about Representative Bass as a possible running mate for Joe Biden. Now, before we ask Representative Bass about her position on Vice President Biden's shortlist, let me take a moment to thank the organizers of today's event. Headliners co-chair team leaders Donna Linewan and Lori Russo. Today's headliner event coordinator Bob Weiner. Club member Ben Lasky, Club Communications Director Lindsay Underwood, and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. Following Representative Bass's opening statement, we'll accept questions from the audience. I'll take as many questions as time permits. To submit a question, please send via email to headliners@press.org. And now, I'll turn the screen over to Representative Karen Bass. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, and good afternoon to everyone. It is an honor to appear before you. Very much an honor to meet you virtually, Lisa Matthews. But I will say that I do hope in the future that I can appear before the club in person. So we are really in a historic moment. You know, I think back to the couple of months ago when the world witnessed the brutal murder of George Floyd. We sat there and we could see it take place over almost 9 minutes. And to me, that represented a profound difference in any video that we had seen before. We saw protests in 50 states around the country. We saw people protesting of every race, every nationality, every gender out there. We even saw people protesting in countries around the world. And on the African continent, all 54 countries came together and essentially leveled a protest at the United Nations about racism in the United States. And so we are in a moment now that I believe has developed into a movement that started with police brutality and has now taken even a bigger issue up, like systemic racism. But I think back to the civil rights movement, and you know that Jim Crow had been going on for over 100 years in the South, and the brutality that had taken place in the South had been going on for years. But it wasn't until the TV cameras went down to the South, pictures were taken, the media was there, and reports were given about what was happening in the South. And that really raised the consciousness of people, not just all around the United States, but around the world. And one of the outcomes was civil rights legislation. And I feel like we're in one of those moments again. Prior to George Floyd, polling would be taken after every time there was a murder that took place on video. And the polling was always the same. I'm going to just make up the numbers to make a point. 70% of white people that were polled would say there is no systemic problem with policing. This was one problem, one example. 70% of African Americans would say there is a systemic problem with policing in the United States. Now the polls reflect a united view. 70% of Americans are saying there is a deep problem here, and it's a problem that we need to address. To me, this presents a real opportunity, and that was the basis in which the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was conceived, put together, and passed. And it was no small matter that every Democrat voted for that bill, because I believe prior to what we saw happen, we wouldn't have even had all of the Democratic support. We even had the votes of 3 Republicans. That was no small matter either, because if you remember, the president tweeted a couple of days before, and he called for all Republicans to oppose the bill. And everybody here knows that when that happens, he usually gets his way, because my Republican colleagues are concerned about him tweeting or attacking them, and they line up, and they didn't this time. I will tell you that in the process of putting the bill together, the hearings we had, the votes we had, any number of my Republican colleagues approached me and said, you know, I can't be 100% in favor of this bill, but I do recognize there's an issue. We need to talk about this. The substance of the bill actually reflected bills that members of the Congressional Black Caucus had worked on for many years. As a matter of fact, this is the 49th year of the Congressional Black Caucus. And in the very beginning of the CBC's history, CBC members introduced legislation to address police abuse, because this is a long-standing issue in our community. In fact, when I went to George Floyd's service and I looked up and I saw the year he was born, 1973, that was the year I first became active on this issue in Los Angeles. I joined an organization called the Coalition Against Police Abuse in 1973, because we had terrible problems in our city, led to numerous lawsuits. We had a police chief that was very difficult, very much out of step. As a matter of fact, African Americans were being killed by chokeholds in large numbers. He had a press conference and he told Los Angeles in a press conference that the reason why Black people died from chokeholds was because our veins were different than white people and our veins didn't open up as rapidly. That's what we were dealing with 47 years ago. And frankly, I thought after the Rodney King beating, when it was on video, I said, well, finally, everything is going to change now because it's on video. Because we had been crying out about these problems for years, but nobody believed us. And every time someone was beat or every time someone was killed, it was always said, well, they assaulted a police officer. The officer was in fear of his life, and that's why it happened. And so we thought with Rodney King, the world would see, and for sure those officers would be convicted. Well, we know what happened. And then fast forward a few years and the cell phone camera is invented. Then I thought, okay, now there's lots of videos. But every time before George Floyd, people would say, oh, we don't really know what happened before the video started. And the officer said he was in fear of his life. And we don't really know who Michael Brown was. Michael Brown was Ferguson. And Eric Gardner, well, you know, he was doing something wrong, as though even if he was committing a crime, when do you execute people? What happened to innocent until proven guilty? What happened to arresting someone and putting them on trial? And so I think that George Floyd was just so egregious, no one could really argue. You didn't need to know what happened before the video. You watched him being murdered over 8 minutes and 46 seconds. You saw that he was completely subdued. And I think that really led to people saying, we can't debate this one this time. And so the movement now has raised other issues, raised the issues of systemic racism, is leading to us looking at our history with the movement around the statues. Now, I certainly don't agree with the violence that has taken place, the looting that has taken place in the protests, but we all know now that protests have happened every single day, and the incidence of violence now, if you add the length of time of the protests, there's really been few examples. The statues, I'd like to see those statues come down, but I think there's a way for them to come down as opposed to vandalizing the statues. But the point is that what started with a killing of George Floyd has now led to bigger questions in our country, like systemic racism and questioning very specific systems, the education system, the criminal justice system, which I'm happy to say there's a lot of bipartisan support for, and I'm going to be introducing a bipartisan bill related to criminal justice system and women next week. If you look at the healthcare system, and prior to George Floyd's murder, as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, I was focused 100% on the disproportionate death rate of African Americans and because of COVID. We could have a whole discussion about COVID and how it's being handled and the fact that there are now 138,000 Americans that have died in the last few months. And in my opinion, a president that doesn't seem to be moved by it at all. In fact, wants us to congratulate him that there's not more Americans. And we don't know what the breakdown of those 138,000 Americans are. The Congressional Black Caucus has introduced legislation to tell the CDC they need to give us the demographics, but now the administration doesn't even want the CDC to have the information. You should know with the Congressional Black Caucus, we work lockstep with the Hispanic Caucus, the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, and now we have 2 Native American women in Congress, and we all work together. We're lockstep because these issues don't just impact Black Americans, they impact Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders. Even the disproportionate death rate has impacted all of our communities in disproportionate ways. So we work together. But just coming back to policing, and Ms. Matthews, you did detail what the bill was about in terms of the accountability measures, the transparency measures. I do want to add that there's 2 parts of the bill, one on transparency and accountability, where we are uplifting the police. Why is it that your hairdresser has national standards, has national accreditation, but your police department doesn't? And so when we met with the Fraternal Order of Police, they're excited by that part of the bill, and they feel that it actually helps them because they've been fighting for national standards and accreditation for a long time, but they have to fight on a retail basis, and there's 18,000 police departments around the country. So us passing the George Floyd Act and hopefully getting it on the president's desk will allow those national standards to then take place around the country that will help the Fraternal Order of the Police. One other piece I want to talk about is the grants that we provide to communities so communities can re-envision policing. And I think that address a lot of what the protesters are talking about when they are raising the question about how we are spending money in our communities. So I prefer to talk about the refunding of communities to address community-based problems like substance abuse and homelessness. And police officers should not have to pick up the pieces because we have divested from cities. So I think we're at a moment in our country, an inflection point, and it's my responsibility and the responsibilities of other members of Congress to take advantage of this point. I do hope the protests continue peacefully until we get the job done. Let me just thank you very much for the honor of addressing me today.
Thank you so much. So much to unpack there, Representative Bass. But I'd like to start with, could you go into a little bit more about the transparency portion of the bill and specifically how that might appeal to the folks with Black Lives Matter?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, one of the things that we absolutely need to have is a national registry of police officers. Now, if you think of Tamir Rice, and I will remind you, Tamir Rice was the 12-year-old child who was killed within seconds after the police officer jumped out of his car and killed him. Well, that police officer had been fired from a nearby department, and he had been fired because he was viewed as unstable with a propensity for violence. Well, and he lied and didn't acknowledge that he had been fired. Well, we think that there should be a registry for officers like that. I don't think there's any police chief in the country that would willingly hire somebody that was known to be unstable and violent. And so that is an example. But I think very significant, the idea that community-based organizations, not law enforcement, community-based organizations can apply for grants, where in a city, they can say, why don't we all come together across sectors? Why don't we look at what we need to keep our community safe? What are the parts of our community that is not safe and why? How should we look at our city budget? How should we reprioritize? In my city, for example, in Los Angeles, the mayor has decided to shift funds to address some of the problems in the community that are not directly law enforcement. I mean, in Los Angeles, we have a jail we call the Twin Towers. We say in Los Angeles, it's the nation's most expensive mental institution. What we have done over the years is we have systematically taken funding away from the safety net and supportive services, and we've started criminalizing health problems. Mental illness should not be criminalized. Now, years ago, we had mental institutions. People decided that those were barbaric and we shouldn't have those anymore. Well, we made a commitment as a society that we were going to build community-based institutions, and we reneged on that commitment. We never did that. And so that is not, obviously, that's not the only reason people are homeless, but it's a contributing factor to a percentage of the homeless situation. And it shouldn't be that a person with mental illness deteriorates to the point where they become violent. We should make sure they have the proper treatment and the medication and whatever else they need so that they don't reach the point of violence. I'm not trying to say that you can send in a social worker to deal with a hostage situation. Obviously, there are times when you need police officers, but you don't need police officers to be marriage counselors. You don't need police officers if you took care of the problem on the front end. Okay. So that's a little bit about transparency and about communities.
Okay. Well, I'm curious to know more about how you're working with Senator Tim Scott, your negotiations on the police reform matter. Can you give us a little insight into those discussions and what the next steps might be?
Sure, and let me actually correct something, because Senator Scott and I are not negotiating. Oh. Senator Scott and I have talked. I mean, we came into Congress together. He was a member of the House before he was in the Senate. So there are no formal negotiations going on. I am always willing and interested to talk to the senator. I look forward to seeing him again when I get back next week. But we essentially had one cordial meeting where we talked about the issue globally. But I have been having a number of conversations with my colleagues in the House. And they're Republican colleagues that came up to me in the course of our conversations around the bill. And we have been having conversations. They've been talking about parts of the bill that they feel good about, parts of the bill that they have angst about, and they're presenting different ideas to me. I am always willing to talk to whoever is interested in having a conversation, but understand that my primary focus is trying to put the pressure on the Senate to vote on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. That is the primary focus right now. And so we'll see what happens. I'm not pessimistic about it. I'm optimistic. Anytime my Republican colleagues come up and say, you know, there's parts of the bill that we like. I mean, I'll tell you something that I thought was kind of funny. During the hearings, during the voting in committee and on the floor, my Republican colleagues talked about everything under the sun but the bill. They talked about everything. And so to me, I viewed that as, maybe there's an opportunity here. I am used to in those discussions, especially in judiciary, where my Republican colleagues tear the bill apart because they disagree with it top to bottom. Instead, they expressed interest and support for different parts of the bill, but I can't vote for it for X, Y, and Z. That tells me there's room. But it would be an overstatement to say that there's negotiations happening. And it would certainly be an overstatement to say I'm negotiating with the Senate, considering I'm a member of the House.
I hear
And
you.
my two Senate colleagues, Senator Harris and Senator Booker, have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in the Senate. And I know they're working with their colleagues.
Well, thank you for the clarification, and we will remember that you're in conversations with some colleagues. Do you see Senator Scott's bill as a sincere effort or something else entirely?
Yes, no. I saw his bill as a sincere effort. Absolutely. I mean, when I did talk to him, and you've heard his public statements, he is a Black man in America. He understands this issue. He can recount the numerous times he's been stopped. And I will say, and I know you're very well aware of this, this is not just an issue for Black men. Black women have this issue as well. And we have conversations with our girls in the same way we have conversations with our boys. This is a legacy issue for us from the time we arrived on this continent.
So how would you propose to prepare the breach that is so apparent between the police and the Black community or communities of color in general?
Right. Well, you know what, I have very specific ways of approaching it because, you know, prior to being an elected official, 30 years ago in 1990, I started a community-based organization in the heart of South Central Los Angeles at the height of the crack cocaine, Crips and Blood crisis that was going on. That year, we had 1,000 homicides in Los Angeles. And so I was so concerned about the issue then, because what I saw happening was, my background is in healthcare. I saw us criminalize addiction. Crack cocaine was a health issue. Then it was also an economic issue because all of the factories closed, industries were leaving the area, nothing was replacing those jobs. I will never forget Newsweek magazine calling crack cocaine an equal opportunity employer. And so I saw crack as a health and an economic issue that we refused to address, and we criminalized it. So I was on the ground doing the grassroots organizing, trying to get my city to not, and the same police chief I was talking about. Now, I mentioned him in 1973. We were still dealing with him in 1990, okay? And what his solution was to the problem was he started a program called Operation Hammer. And what Operation Hammer was is every weekend, they would just do mass arrests of Black and Latino youth. And to me, that was not the way to deal with the problem. At the time, I was a full-time member of the faculty at the University of Southern California Medical School. I walked away from that. I started an organization to try to come up with community-based solutions to address crime that didn't involve criminalization. So we were fighting against 3 strikes. We were fighting against all of the draconian ballot propositions that were happening in California. And what we started doing was we started organizing the neighborhoods. We started working with the active gang members, the former gang members. We brought everybody to the table. We talked about the fact that we wanted to keep the neighborhood safe without everybody going to jail. We had separate meetings with the police. We worked with the police officers until we found officers that did not have that warrior mentality of, you know, we're here in South Central and we feel like it's Baghdad, so we want to kick butt, as they would say. And we found officers that genuinely were interested in how do we prevent crime? How do we prevent it from happening? And there are solutions. There's lots of examples around the country of community-based policing, of community safety patrols. As a matter of fact, in Los Angeles, I think maybe it was yesterday, they had a press conference talking about when the mayor shifted the money away from the police department, part of where he's shifting it to is programs that do this type of work. We started working with gang members, getting them to leave gangs. We started working with young people to divert them away from gang involvement. As a matter of fact, my ideas during those times was, can I get a young person in middle school or high school, can I get them interested in politics? Can I get them interested in fighting to improve the conditions in their schools? Is that a way to capture that adolescent energy into productive activism? And I will tell you that that was 30 years ago. Some of those young people are still there. They're not young people anymore. They're in their 40s now. But they went away to college, came back, and are now running the organization. So that's just one example. But communities around the country are dealing with this issue. And something else I want to address, because this is often confused. People will say, well, Black people seem to be very concerned about homicide or murder if it's done by a police officer. But Black people don't seem to be concerned when it's done by another Black person. And that's just so not true. What that represents, what that mentality represents, is basic ignorance of what happens in our communities, because there are people that work day in and day out to try to address the violence that is not associated with policing. But these organizations and these people are never given the resources in a way to address these issues on scale. And they're also never given the resources in a sustained manner. So we will throw money for 4 or 5 years, the homicide rate will go down, and then we'll say the problem's solved, and then we'll cut the funding. And then when the problem comes back, we'll say the programs didn't work. And so it's a catch-22 that we put communities in. And so part of the notion of looking at how we fund these issues really raises these kind of questions. Why don't we make a commitment as a country to address these issues in a comprehensive and sustained manner?
So I know that police reform is at the top of your agenda, but you mentioned healthcare as being something that you're very passionate about. Talk a little bit about coronavirus and the impact it's having on your home state of California. What went wrong there? What has gone wrong in California?
I will tell you that I'm not sure what went wrong. And I say that because the leadership in our state, in our city, and in our county were very aggressive from the beginning and did what they were supposed to do. Now, California is a diverse state. I mean, 40 million people. So there are parts of California, for example, 1 hour away from Los Angeles is Orange County. And in Orange County, they've decided to reopen the schools without social distancing, without masks. And so there are parts in our state that did that. I can't tell you because I don't think the analysis has been done yet. I don't know if if those factors were contributing to the upsurge that we had, but it just shows you how difficult this virus is. And it is also, I mean, when the history is written on this a couple of years from now, the lack of leadership, it's just malpractice, the lack of leadership from the top. And now we have a leader who has basically decided to adopt magical thinking, and he's just going to wish it away. He's just going to say, I mean, the reason why we have so many cases is because we test. I mean, that's just ludicrous. It's embarrassing. And it's embarrassing to us on the world stage. I will tell you, with a health background and also with a foreign policy background, I remember when the Obama administration faced Ebola. Ebola could have been a pandemic. Ebola was concentrated in 3 countries in Africa. It could have spread throughout all 54 countries. But what did President Obama do? He galvanized the entire world because we had the stature and the standing in the world at the time. The Obama-Biden administration brought all of the countries together, and they were able to contain Ebola in 3 countries. 2 people died in the United States. I think if we had had a real leader who could lead domestically and internationally, maybe we would have worked with the Chinese. Maybe we would have galvanized the world to say, this is a potential pandemic, we have to stop it. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't have spread, but one thing I believe very deeply, there is no way in the world that 138,000 Americans should be dead today if we had had better leadership that went after this aggressively, that understood it. And now we're bearing the brunt of it because of the lack of leadership. Now we're in another upsurge, and they've politicized it. So those people that wear masks are sellouts. And if I want my constitutional freedom, I should have the right, number one, to die and to kill other people.
So
It is an embarrassment.
Representative Bass, you've been talking a lot about, you've said leadership quite a bit.
Yeah.
Leadership. So Vice President Bass, maybe?
You know, I don't know. I will tell you that any of those questions, you know what I'm going to say, have to be referred to the campaign. But let me just tell you, though.
Well, can you share with us where you are, where you are in the vetting process?
No, you can talk to the campaign about that. I have nothing to say. But here's what I will tell you, though, is that, you know, every 4 years we always say that this is the most important election of your lifetime. I believe because of COVID, this election is a matter of life and death. If we don't have the leadership to bring this under control, I mean, the craziness of we have to rush to open up the economy. Everyone wants to do that. I would like to be in front of the National Press Club right now. I'd love to go to a restaurant or to go visit friends.
We'd love to have you.
Thank you. You can't just deny things and expect it to get better. How on earth do you expect the economy to get back if you can't contain the virus? And what I believe the administration is doing without really acknowledging is really adopting a strategy of herd immunity, which means everybody just needs to be exposed. We need to recognize that people will die. And I heard the president say this, and it just hurt my heart. He said, well, you know, the people that are dying are older and they're people with a lot of health problems, as though that's okay. You know, I was involved in the medical field when when AIDS was first discovered. As a matter of fact, we knew there was this pneumonia that was affecting gay men. We didn't even know what to call it. I was working in the emergency room when we didn't have protective gear. We didn't even draw blood with gloves. I mean, we weren't even trained to do that. And so I have complete empathy for those healthcare workers because we were afraid every single day. I mean, if you got a pinprick or anything, we never knew whether or not we were exposing ourselves. And I watched people die because of HIV. So when I see and hear the healthcare workers, it throws me back to that time. And we were able to get a hold of it. And it took years before we had the cocktail and before we managed HIV. And to this day, we don't have a vaccine. So we have to figure out, I hope we get a vaccine, but what if we don't? You can't just deny this and say, we know we're going to lose some people and we'll just have to deal with that, but we need the economy to come back. It's utter madness. And frankly, the world is looking at us, and there's some places we can't even go to as Americans because of the way this has been so mishandled.
Okay. I also want to ask, and we're getting quite a few questions in from people who are watching this online, so excuse me when I look down to ask you some of these questions. This question comes to us from Nicholas Wu with USA Today. Nicholas writes, it looks like both parties are at different ends on the upcoming stimulus negotiations. Where's the middle ground between members of Congress on issues like unemployment insurance and school funding?
You know what? It's so hard for me to imagine that there is a middle ground, in the sense that the HEROES Act, if you want to fund the police, if you want to fund first responders, we need to pass the HEROES Act. Why would we put people through the psychological pain of knowing that in the next few weeks their unemployment check is going to run out? When you know you need to pass a bill, why are you going to quibble over a $600 check when you take $500 billion and you don't even want to disclose what's going to happen with that money? When you give no bid contracts to people to do the protective equipment who have no experience doing that at all. I mean, we don't know what's happening with that money.
Okay.
And that is billions and billions of dollars. But yet you're going to argue over a $600 check because you say, well, if a person gets that extra boost in their unemployment, they're not going to want to go to work. And we want everybody to go to work. As a matter of fact, we want to force them to go to work. And we want to make sure that any employer that forces its folks back to work cannot be sued. So just think about the meat packing places where they were ordered to go back to work, where the president, he used his power to force people to go back to work, but won't use his power to have massive testing, massive tracing, and massive treatment. So we will see. I know those negotiations are going on, and I'm not a direct party to them.
Another question from Michelle Bond. Since your 2019 Put Victims First Act passed, have you received reports in regards to the impact this has had in assisting trafficking survivors? Kind of all over the map here, but.
Right. No, and we need to get that reporting. Let me just give a little bit of background. I have been working on the child welfare system and transforming the child welfare system for the last 30 years. Every year I've been in Congress. As a matter of fact, I formed a bipartisan caucus on child welfare because it is a very bipartisan issue. Well, one of the casualties of our child welfare system is a number of the girls and boys, primarily females, but boys as well, get involved in sex trafficking to survive, survival sex. And I hate to tell you this, but the average age of a girl that's trafficked is 12 years old. And a lot of that trafficking takes place online. And so we did pass legislation to address that. But one of the problems, and this is a universal problem, not just a problem in this area, getting information out of this administration on anything is challenging. I mentioned we couldn't get the demographic information from the Center for Disease Control. Well, getting information from Health and Human Services about how we're doing on that issue is very difficult as well.
So going back to coronavirus, now that back in California again, now it's being forced that there's this new surge to roll back. They've got to roll back reopenings.
Right. That's right.
What do you think about their plans overall for kids returning to school? You mentioned Orange County with the kids going back with nothing, but is it good enough to just do online learning?
No, it's not. It's a real problem. So first of all, I think what Orange County is doing is absolutely terrible and irresponsible. But looking at my own school district, the Los Angeles Unified School District, where the superintendent said, we're going to stick with online learning, I don't think that there's a choice for that. But, and one of the things that LA Unified is doing that I think is really good is they have their own TV station. And so they're also doing television. And let me just give you an example. When I went to my grandson, who's 5, when I went to pick up the laptop from his school, I thought about it for a minute because, you know, when you think about online learning and you think about young people, you kind of have this viewpoint that all young people know how to use computers. Well, in Los Angeles, I don't have to worry about not having access to broadband because, of course, we do. That doesn't mean everybody can afford it, though, okay? It's here, but can you afford it? But also, what about the parents? A 5-year-old doesn't innately know how to use a computer. So I think the assumption when you think about young people and technology, you're really thinking about adolescents. What about the young children whose parents might not know how to use that computer, or they're working 3 jobs and they're essential workers, so they're not at home? So I do think that it's a real problem. I think that LA Unified is doing the best they can. I like the idea of having the television as a backup because, you know, people do have televisions. But so, you know, before COVID, we had a very serious achievement gap, right? What are we going to have after COVID? The achievement gap is going to be really exacerbated. And so one of the things that I think needs to happen, and again, because we're in one of these moments, one of these inflection moments and reflection moments, Maybe it's an opportunity when we're looking at systemic racism, the achievement gap is a manifestation of that. I think we're going to need to do something really aggressive when it comes to education. Just think, you were already dealing with a gap, and now you're going to have kids who've essentially lost an entire year of education.
So I have to tell you that I'm getting lots of questions about you being vice president. And I know you said that we should refer all questions to the campaign. But could you tell me what makes for a good vice president? What are the qualifications of someone who would be working alongside Joe Biden, say he wins in this upcoming election?
Sure, and this is just my opinion. First of all, he is the leading expert, having been a vice president, as to what he needs for a vice president. But my opinion is that he needs a partner. He needs somebody who is going to hunker down and say, we have multiple crises. I mean, what I feel bad about is that when he is sworn in January, and he just has to be sworn in January, when he is sworn in January, just think about what he's inheriting. He is going to inherit an economy that Lord knows where it will be in 6 months because of the negligence of this president. Unless he wakes up tomorrow and decides to address this problem, there could even be 200,000 dead Americans by that point, and a pandemic that is not under control at all. The good thing about the vice president, if you want to say this is a good thing, remember when he was sworn in the last time, he inherited an economy that was a disaster. So if anybody is equipped to figure out how to get out of the disaster, it is him. And I believe that he needs a partner in that, somebody that is willing to say, I will take this piece, I will focus on this, while you're putting the world back together. I think about his international credentials, and I think that had he been president at the beginning of this virus, he would have addressed it from an international perspective first, and he would have employed every possible resource in the United States to have aggressively dealt with that. And so I think, number one, it's a partner. I also think it's somebody who can help heal, because this nation is going to need healing. We've all been traumatized for the last 3.5 years on a daily basis, and sometimes multiple times a day. If you think about race relations in this country, I mean, the president just a couple of days ago said, well, he's worried about white people being killed by police. Now, we know more white people are killed by police than anybody else. Why is that? Because there's more white people in the United States. The point is the proportion, and it is disproportionately by 2 to 3 times as many. That's what's important. But he always goes to race whenever he is in a tight spot.
Going back to the strengths of a vice president, what about strength in foreign relations? Today it was all over the news that Russia was trying to basically steal information on how to put together a vaccine for coronavirus from the United States and Britain and others. How do you see a vice president, or even in a new administration, dealing with a country like Russia over an instance like that?
Well, I mean, I think that, foreign affairs is essential. And talk about healing. We have to heal on the international front too, because the president has embarrassed us repeatedly by publicly standing up and supporting Putin when Russia is causing problems in a lot of the European nations, breaking treaties. But, if you look at the women that are being talked about, I mean, it's an incredible group of women. I mean, you have Tammy Duckworth, who certainly understands foreign policy. Susan Rice, for goodness sake, former ambassador to the United Nations. Kamala Harris, who was on the Intelligence Committee and Judiciary. Tammy Baldwin. I mean, I think that there are a variety of women who bring a tremendous background to this, and who could be a wonderful partner with the president. President Biden.
What would you bring to the table?
Well, What I bring to the table, regardless of where I am, is my deep commitment to do whatever is necessary to heal this country. To me, what is needed immediately is on the health front. That is more important than anything. And the economy, to me, is so intertwined with the crisis, you can't separate the two. And the problem that we're facing now is the president keeps trying to say, let's just focus on the economy and let me sit here and pretend that the health issue will go away. Well, you cannot do that. And in my opinion, I feel he has spent 3.5 years tearing this country apart in terms of race relations. He started with Mexicans when he came down the escalator. He has insulted Native Americans. And now, and of course, what he said about Black Americans from day one, but now he's after Asian Americans because by trying to blame China for COVID, that has led to an increase in anti-Asian violence all over the country. If you think about the last election before 2018, you know we had 4 acts of domestic terrorism, 4 acts right before the last election. You remember he talked about the invasion that was coming from Central America? You remember the man that put bombs, of course, fortunately, none of the bombs went off, and his van was draped in Trump paraphernalia. There was the white man who wanted to kill Black people. He tried to get into a church. The church was locked, so he killed 2 African Americans in a store. There was the horrific attack on the synagogue, the worst attack in a synagogue in US history. You remember when they arrested that man, he said the reason why he attacked the synagogue was because Jewish people were funding the invasion of Central Americans. And then a couple of days later, there was an attack on women of color at a yoga studio. And the election was a few days later. One of our challenges in our country is that we tend to have very short memories. But those attacks were preceded by the president on a daily basis whipping up dissent, whipping up division. And we see him do this every time he needs to distract away from something. So he's going to tell the police, the federal police, to defend Confederate statues because they're a glorious part of our history. People who were traitors, people who tried to break up the country so that they could continue enslaving my ancestors. That's who he wants to defend. All of that is going to have to be put back together again next year.
Curious what you think about what should be done in the case of Breonna Taylor, and how far that case has and has not gone locally, and what you think should be done next.
Well, first of all, in our bill, in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, we ban no-knock warrants for drugs. I mean, one of the reasons for a no-knock warrant is because we don't want the individual to flush the drugs down the toilet. Is that really worth it? Over the last 10 years, no-knocks have been studied. 94 people have died. 16 of them were police officers. So is that really the best way to go about it? So we ban no-knocks. But I think that those officers have not been arrested, as far as I'm aware. They have been fired. They should be arrested. I think until we show police officers that there is a consequence. When that man was killing George Floyd, he had his hand in his pocket and he was looking at the camera with complete impunity. He didn't feel anything was going to happen to him. And it's that kind of thing, or the young man that was killed in Colorado, and you saw the police officers reenacting the chokehold. As long as you have a culture in a police department that basically says that police officers can do whatever they want, so long as they're doing it in certain communities and to certain people. I represent a district in Los Angeles where part of my district is very affluent, predominantly white. The other part of my district is South Central Los Angeles. When the police go to my district, when they go on one side of town, they go to protect and serve. When they go to the other side of town, they go to knock heads. So it's a warrior mentality versus a guardian mentality. And police officers on every level have told me that they have to deal with officers when they come out of the academy, some of them. Now, let me just state for the record, we know that the vast majority of police officers are not like this, and they protect and serve. But there are some that when they come out of the academy, request to go to South Central so they can earn their stripes, so they can knock heads. If that's how you come to a community, then why would you be surprised that the people in the community do not view the police officers as there to protect them at all, and in fact fear the police officers?
So some might say that or question whether a few bad apples requires a complete overhaul of a system. What do you say to that?
Well, I don't think there's a few bad apples. I think there are systemic problems. And one of the things that police officers have done over the years, and conservative organizations, because this is not necessarily police officers, but they've passed state laws that essentially make them exempt from everything. The police culture that says, if there's a bad officer, let's circle our wagons. I mean, case in point, the man that everybody saw this on TV, the older man in New York, upstate New York, who was a protester, and the police saw him, they pushed him down. Now they lied. They lied, and they said he tripped and fell. Something Black communities, Black people say all the time, that the police officer lies, but people didn't believe it, right? Well, everybody saw them push him down. You saw one officer lean over to try to render aid, and you saw another officer pull him away. Well, when those officers got in trouble, then 57 officers resigned from that unit. That's the kind of mentality that reflects a culture that is very problematic. And by the way, last year, an African-American woman who was an officer in that same department, she stopped one of her fellow officers in the middle of a chokehold because she thought he was going to kill someone. She got fired. In Minneapolis, the police chief has said he has fired bad officers, but the officers, because of their contract, have a process of arbitration. So he could fire an officer. The officer could go to arbitration and win and be put back on the force. The officer that killed George Floyd had 17 different complaints. So those are some structural things that happen in a lot of departments where even when you have good officers, if they are functioning in a corrupt culture, they have to make a decision. They go along with that culture or they leave, because they understand that they might even be in danger. And you know, you've all heard those stories. Well, if you don't go along with the program, when you're in help, maybe I won't rush as fast.
Yeah.
So I don't think we can reduce it to a few bad apples.
Okay. We're getting questions from so many people and we're running out of time, but I want to get to this because I'm getting a strand of emails asking about this question from Dion Moore in LA County, so from your state. She asks, will Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States see reparations in your lifetime? And will the wealth gap be closed in your lifetime? Now that's a massive question, but we don't have a whole lot of time, but
well, I mean, let me just quickly say that the Congressional Black Caucus, after we passed the George Floyd Act, introduced and talked about legislation that we're dealing with to address systemic racism. So we understand that policing is just one manifestation of systemic racism, but the wealth gap, the achievement gap, all of those issues are part of that same system that we need to root out the discrimination. And so we do have a very specific legislation to address those issues. In addition, we are preparing a massive piece of legislation called Jobs and Justice that does address many of the issues related to systemic racism. And in terms of reparations, there's HR 40 that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee is leading that calls for the formation of a commission to study the impact that the period of enslavement had. I think that most Americans, if you polled most Americans, and if you asked them how long slavery existed in the United States, very few would have the correct answer, which is 256 years, 100 years before we were even a country. And then even fewer Americans will understand that for 100 years after slavery, we had lynchings and Jim Crow. And to date, we have not been able to pass, 2020, have not been able to pass a federal law against lynching.
You mentioned a law that you're going, or a bill that you're going to be introducing soon. Do you want to share a little bit with us about that? Yeah.
Sure. I've been working on criminal justice reform for many, many, many years. But typically, when you hear people talk about criminal justice reform, they're really only talking about men. They are not talking about women nor children. We are one of the few countries in the world that incarcerate kids. So the bill that I am working on is a bill that's specifically looking at women who are pregnant and incarcerated. That's something else that a lot of people don't realize. We did have part of what we're trying to address passed in the First Step Act. So we have had a brutal practice in our country. If you can imagine a woman who is ready to deliver a baby and she's incarcerated, and we shackle her to the gurney during labor, because, you know, a woman 9 months pregnant in the middle of labor and delivery is a flight risk. So we banned that because it's a barbaric practice. But it does still go on in some states. We banned it in federal institutions. But every aspect of women in the criminal justice system is different than men. We'll get to a comprehensive bill a little later, but the bill I am working on a bipartisan basis now is about pregnant women who are incarcerated. And their health care, treatment, et cetera.
Yeah. A final question for you as we come to the end of the hour here. This question comes from Gabrielle Gurley. How do you navigate the various political currents within the membership of the CBC? And what does it mean when Tim Scott, the GOP's only black senator, is not a member of the Congressional Black Caucus?
Well, you know, again, Tim and I came in together, and that was his choice. He chose not to be a member of the Black Caucus. We didn't take that as an assault. I think that he didn't necessarily want to be in the room with 50 plus Democrats. Maybe that was the issue. But when Mia Love, who was also a Republican from Utah, she was a very active member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, she lost her election, so she's not there anymore. But certainly the door is open to Tim anytime he would choose to be a part of the caucus. There are 55 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. It is very diverse politically. And how I navigate it, we refer to the CBC as a family. So the same way you'd navigate your family.
Okay. Well, I think we've got time for one more question. And I'm going to go back to the Vice President question. If Joe Biden asks you to be his running mate, will you accept?
Let me just tell you that I am so concerned about him being elected and him having a successful presidency. He could ask me to go volunteer at a local office and lick stamps, if you still do that anymore, walk precincts, whatever is needed, I am ready.
All righty then. We're coming up to time. I think I might have time for one more question. What do you see as that's too much of a question, I think, for the remaining minute that we have here. I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. There was so much to unpack, and thank you so much for indulging us with all the questions about a potential vice presidency. Certainly, serving as the National Press Club's vice president, I'm happy to offer you some advice on being vice president in the future, should that happen for you. I also would like to say that we typically offer our guests the National Press Club mug. So if you were here, I would be handing this to you today. But we want to thank you so very, very much for joining us here at the Press Club. And we also want to let folks who are watching know that we are continuing with our programming here at the National Press Club. and we intend to continue to make the club the place where news happens. So thank you again, Representative Bass, for all of your time and your comments today.
Well, thank you. It was an honor to be here, and I look forward to getting that mug.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.